In 24 hours, beginning at 6 o'clock on the evening of the 19th of July, 1916, 5,533 Australian soldiers became casualties in a battle that achieved absolutely nothing. Not 1 meter of ground was gained. Not one strategic objective was accomplished. Not one German division was prevented from reinforcing the Somme offensive that this attack was meant to support. The dead, wounded, and captured equaled the total Australian casualties from the Boer War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined, except these losses occurred in a single night of fighting at a place called Fromelles, 16 kilometers west of Lille in French Flanders. The Australian War Memorial describes it as the worst 24 hours in Australia's entire military history. The question that haunts military historians is not whether this disaster could have been prevented, but how experienced commanders with access to accurate intelligence about German defenses, with warnings from subordinate officers about the impossibility of success, with aerial photographs showing the strength of enemy positions, nevertheless ordered men to attack in circumstances that anyone with Western Front knowledge would have recognized as producing certain catastrophe from the moment the plan was conceived. On the 1st of July, 1916, the British Expeditionary Force launched its great offensive along the Somme River in northern France, an attack that had been planned for months and represented the largest British military operation of the war to that point. On that single day, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, British forces sustained 60,000 casualties, including 20,000 dead, the bloodiest day in British military history, and a disaster that shocked commanders who had believed their week-long preliminary bombardment would destroy German defenses and allow infantry to walk across no man's land and occupy abandoned trenches. By the 5th of July, as the Somme offensive ground forward at enormous cost and minimal territorial gain, General Headquarters at Montreuil feared that German commanders might recognize the Somme as the primary threat and begin transferring reserves from quieter sectors of the Western Front to reinforce their defenses in the threatened area. The British strategic concept required preventing such transfers, pinning German forces in place along the entire Western Front through actual attacks or the credible threat of attacks that would prevent concentration of German reserves against the main offensive. General Sir Douglas Haig, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, ordered his 1st and 2nd Army commanders to prepare supporting attacks that would fix German reserves in their current positions and create the impression that offensive operations might develop anywhere along the line from the Belgian coast to the Somme. On the 8th of July, General Sir Charles Monro, commanding 1st Army, ordered Lieutenant General Richard Haking of the 11th Corps to plan a 2-division attack against German positions in the Fromelles sector of the Western Front. Haking, demonstrating the over-optimism that would characterize his entire approach to this operation, proposed capturing Aubers Ridge, the village of Aubers, and Fromelles itself, an ambitious scheme that would require breaking through multiple lines of German defenses and advancing several miles into enemy-held territory. Monro scaled back these grandiose objectives the following day after consulting with General Herbert Plumer of 2nd Army, recognizing that the forces available and the time available for preparation made Haking's original concept completely unrealistic. The final objective became more modest, reducing to an operation intended merely to eliminate a small German salient that protruded into British lines, demonstrate Allied offensive capability to prevent German commanders from believing the Fromelles sector was completely quiet, and force German units to remain in place rather than transferring to reinforce defenses on the Somme. The attack would occur 50 miles north of the Somme battlefield, far enough removed that German commanders could not easily shift reserves between the two battlefields, even if they wanted to, close enough that the strategic connection between the two operations would be obvious to German intelligence officers analyzing British intentions. The terrain chosen for this diversionary effort would prove ideal for defenders and catastrophic for attackers in ways that should have been evident to anyone who examined the ground with even minimal tactical understanding. Fromelles sat in flat agricultural land stretching from the German-held Aubert Ridge northward to the Lys River and the town of Armentières, a landscape that resembled an ironing board more than a battlefield. The ridge itself was barely worthy of the name, a gentle rise perhaps 30 meters higher than the surrounding plain. But in this utterly level country where elevation changes of 10 meters were considered significant features, even minor rises provided commanding observation over vast areas. German forces had captured Fromelles village on the 9th of October, 1914, during the race to the sea when German and Allied armies attempted to outflank each other northward toward the English Channel, and had occupied these positions continuously for nearly 2 years, fortifying them with the care and thoroughness that characterized German defensive engineering throughout the Western Front. From an observation post built inside the church tower at Fromelles village, German observers commanded a panoramic view of the battlefield below, where every meter of no man's land, every communication trench, every approach route, every assembly area lay exposed to observation and could be targeted by pre-registered artillery fire that required only a telephone call from observers to battery commanders to bring down devastating bombardment on any location where British or Australian activity was detected. The Sugarloaf, a small salient projecting from the German line like a cancerous growth, dominated the tactical geography of the entire sector and would prove to be the killing ground where the 15th Australian Brigade would be destroyed. This raised area, fortified with concrete bunkers and surrounded by thick belts of barbed wire that the preliminary bombardment would fail to cut adequately, gave German machine gunners positioned in concrete pillboxes unobstructed fields of fire across no man's land that varied from 100 to 400 yards in width, depending on location. The ground between the opposing trenches was completely exposed, offering no cover except water-filled shell craters from previous bombardments and agricultural drainage ditches that provided minimal protection and became death traps when German artillery found the range and poured high explosive and shrapnel into these depressions where soldiers sought refuge. The low-lying nature of the terrain meant that water tables sat close to the surface throughout the region, making proper trench construction impossible in many locations where digging down more than a few feet encountered standing water. Both sides had built breastworks rather than trenches in these waterlogged areas, raising defensive positions above ground level using sandbags and excavated earth, creating walls behind which infantry could shelter, but which also meant that attacking forces would be silhouetted against the sky as they advanced, making them perfect targets for German machine gunners who had spent months calculating ranges and establishing interlocking fields of fire that would turn no man's land into a death zone. The German 6th Bavarian Reserve Division held this sector, a veteran formation that had fought continuously since entering the war at the First Battle of Ypres in late October 1914, where it had helped stop the British advance toward the Belgian coast and establish the static trench line that would characterize the Western Front for the next 4 years. The division deployed 4 regiments across a frontage of 4.5 miles, from east of Aubert village north to a point near Bois Grenier, with each regiment maintaining one battalion in the front line, one in support positions behind the front line, ready to counterattack if enemy forces penetrated the forward defenses, and one in reserve further back where it could rest and refit while remaining close enough to intervene if a major attack developed. On one regimental front alone, German engineers had constructed 75 concrete shelters with 9 to 12 inches of reinforced concrete overhead protection, sufficient to survive all but direct hits from the heaviest Allied artillery. Underground dugouts 30 feet deep provided bomb-proof refuge for entire companies during bombardments, allowing German infantry to shelter safely while Allied artillery expended thousands of shells that accomplished little beyond churning up the surface soil and creating a lunar landscape of overlapping craters. Machine gun positions were sited in concrete pillboxes with carefully calculated fields of fire that overlapped to create zones where nothing could survive, where any attacking force would be caught in crossfire from multiple directions simultaneously. Bayern Nord. The forward German headquarters for this sector sat on the reverse slope of Aubers Ridge between Fromelles and Aubers villages, positioned where Allied artillery could not observe it directly because the crest of the ridge blocked line of sight, but from which German commanders could monitor the entire defensive sector through telephone connections to forward observation posts, and could coordinate defensive fires with the mechanical precision that German military doctrine emphasized. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the German Sixth Army responsible for this entire sector of the Western Front, had opposed the extensive fortification program on philosophical grounds, arguing that elaborate rear positions would undermine soldiers' determination to hold the front line by providing them with a fallback option that might tempt them to withdraw rather than fight to the last. The defensive preparations proved their worth repeatedly when British attacks against these positions failed with catastrophic losses. The sector had been quiet since the Battle of Loos in September and October of 1915, allowing German engineers months to perfect their defenses without interruption from enemy attacks or raids that might have disrupted construction work. By July of 1916, attacking forces would face not merely trenches and barbed wire, but a defensive system designed through careful analysis of previous battles to defeat precisely the kind of frontal assault that British planners were preparing to order. The Germans knew this ground intimately. They had measured every distance, cleared every field of fire, pre-registered every likely target, and trained their infantry and artillery to coordinate defensive fires with mechanical precision that turned defensive battles into exercises in systematic destruction of attacking forces. Against these prepared positions defended by veteran troops who understood their defensive system perfectly, British planners would commit 2 divisions that had never experienced Western Front combat. The 5th Australian Division was the last of 4 Australian divisions to reach France, arriving in June of 1916 after the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Divisions had already deployed to the Western Front and begun learning the harsh lessons of trench warfare. Despite being the newest division, the least experienced formation in the Australian Imperial Force, the 5th Division would be the first committed to major action on the Western Front, a reversal of normal practice that reflected both the urgency of operations on the Somme that had stripped more experienced divisions from quieter sectors, and the simple misfortune that attended this formation from its creation through its eventual destruction at Fromelles. Major General James Whiteside Mackay, born on the 21st of December, 1864, in Ballynor, County Antrim, Ireland, assumed command of the 5th Division on the 22nd of March, 1916, after recovering from wounds sustained at Gallipoli, where he had commanded the 2nd Infantry Brigade during the landing and subsequent fighting. Mackay was a man of formidable intellect and impressive credentials. Educated at the University of Melbourne, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts in 1892, a Master of Arts in 1894, and a Master of Law with first-class honors in 1897, academic achievements that demonstrated both intellectual capacity and determination to excel. He had served as Victorian Defence Minister from 1904 to 1905, combining political prominence with military service in the militia forces. He had commanded the 2nd Infantry Brigade at the Gallipoli landing on the 25th of April, 1915, demonstrating personal courage under fire and tactical competence in extremely difficult circumstances. His career combined political prominence, legal practice, and military service in ways that made him simultaneously qualified by education and experience to command a division yet unpopular with soldiers who distrusted his political background and viewed him as a martinet more concerned with regulations and paperwork than with the welfare of the men under his command. The distrust that would eventually focus on Mackay after Fromelles had roots that predated the battle, roots that grew from an administrative disaster that occurred before the 5th Division even reached France. The division's troubles began with what became known among the soldiers as the Desert March, an administrative decision whose tragic consequences Mackay protested vigorously but could not prevent because the order came from higher headquarters that had authority over divisional commanders. When General Headquarters in Egypt ordered the 2nd Anzac Corps to relieve 1st Anzac Corps in defending the Suez Canal against potential Turkish attacks, allowing the 1st Anzac divisions to deploy to France, where they were desperately needed to reinforce British forces on the Somme, staff planners at Corps headquarters made what seemed like a reasonable decision on paper, but proved catastrophic in execution. They ordered the 5th Division to march 57 kilometers across desert, from their camp at Tel el-Kebir to ferry post on the Suez Canal, a distance that seemed manageable given that trained infantry routinely marched 20 to 30 kilometers in a day during peacetime training exercises. The march took 3 days in extreme heat that reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures that would have made any prolonged physical exertion dangerous even for acclimatized troops carrying minimal loads. The 5th Division soldiers were carrying full equipment, including weapons, ammunition, packs, and supplies, adding 30 to 40 pounds to the weight each man had to carry while marching through soft sand under a merciless sun. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion by the hundreds during the first day of marching. Officers tried to maintain unit cohesion and march discipline while watching their soldiers fall like casualties from an invisible enemy. Medical facilities were overwhelmed by the flood of heat casualties, requiring immediate treatment to prevent death from heat stroke. Many soldiers were helped to safety by a New Zealand unit that was stationed along the march route and volunteered assistance upon learning of the disaster unfolding in the desert before them, sending out search parties to locate collapsed soldiers and bringing them water and medical care that saved lives. The division completed the march in complete disarray, with hundreds of soldiers suffering heat illness and dehydration that required weeks of recovery before they were fit for duty again. Mackay had voiced strong concerns about the order before it was executed, warning his superiors that marching in such heat across such distance would produce mass casualties. But he followed instructions from higher headquarters because military discipline required obedience to orders, even when the officer receiving those orders believed they were mistaken. His words of warning afterward, his _0 statements that were entirely justified by events, soured relations with soldiers who blamed him for their suffering, regardless of where responsibility actually lay. The memory of the Desert March remained bitter throughout the division, establishing a foundation of distrust between division commander and troops that would persist through everything that followed and would explode into open hostility after Fromelles, when soldiers needed someone to blame for the disaster and Mackay provided a convenient target. The division consisted of 3 infantry brigades, each commanded by a brigadier general and each with its own distinct character, shaped by the regional origins of its battalions and the personality of its commander. The 8th Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Edwin Tivey, a Boer War veteran and professional soldier who had spent his entire adult life in military service, consisted of the 29th Battalion, recruited primarily from Victoria, the 30th Battalion from New South Wales, the 31st Battalion from Queensland and Victoria, and the 32nd Battalion from Western Australia and South Australia. The 14th Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Harold Pope, a relatively recent appointment who was inexperienced at commanding formations as large as a brigade, comprised 4 battalions all recruited from New South Wales, the 53rd, 54th, 55th, and 56th Battalions, units that would suffer losses so devastating that entire communities back home in New South Wales would be affected when casualty lists were published, showing dozens of men from the same towns killed or wounded in a single night. The 15th Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General Harold Edward Elliott, was an entirely Victorian formation consisting of the 57th, 58th, 59th, and 60th Battalions, units that Elliott had trained with the same intensity and personal involvement that had characterized his command of the 7th Battalion at Gallipoli. Elliott stood apart from his fellow brigade commanders in almost every respect that mattered to soldiers and to the conduct of military operations. Born on the 19th of June, 1878, at West Charlton, Victoria, he had attended the University of Melbourne, where he studied law while simultaneously establishing himself as a champion shot putter and footballer, athletic achievements that reflected both natural physical gifts and the competitive drive that would characterize his entire military career. His physical presence commanded attention, even in an army filled with large men, a massive frame built by athletics and hardened by military service, that included combat in the Boer War, where he earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal, second only to the Victoria Cross for gallantry, and received a congratulatory telegram from General Lord Kitchener for defending a post against numerically superior Boer forces. He had commanded the 7th Battalion at Gallipoli, landing on the 25th of April, 1915, only to be shot in the foot and evacuated to hospital ships offshore the same day he landed, a wound that seemed likely to end his participation in the Gallipoli campaign. After recovering and returning to his battalion in June, he commanded the 7th Battalion at Lone Pine on the 8th of August, 1915, where 4 of the 7 Victoria Crosses awarded for that battle went to men of the 7th Battalion, a testament to both their courage and his leadership that had trained them and led them into one of the most savage, close-quarters battles of the entire Gallipoli campaign. Elliott's promotion to Brigadier General on the 1st of March, 1916, came with the congenial task of organizing and training the 15th Brigade, work he approached with characteristic intensity and attention to detail. His men called him Pompey, a nickname he disliked intensely but could not escape, apparently derived from a Carlton footballer of that nickname, rather than having anything to do with the Roman general, whose name might have seemed appropriate given Elliott's commanding presence and military bearing. Elliot's leadership style combined fierce protectiveness of his soldiers with explosive temper directed at superior officers when he believed their orders would waste lives unnecessarily. A combination that made him beloved by his troops and intensely disliked by staff officers at higher headquarters, who preferred subordinates who accepted orders without questioning the wisdom of plans developed far from the front lines. When told during discussions about officer appointments that certain unsuitable commanders must remain in their positions because their reputations were sacred and removing them would cause political difficulties, Elliot replied that the lives of his men were more sacred than any officer's reputation, a statement that captured his entire philosophy of command and explained why his soldiers would have followed him anywhere. He visited the front line daily at dawn, regardless of enemy shelling, or the danger that such predictable behavior created, checking on his men and allowing them to see that their brigade commander shared their risks. He thrived on battle in ways that peacetime soldiering never satisfied, writing to his wife that it was beautiful to see his men fight, expressing sentiments that might seem bloodthirsty in peacetime, but reflected the warrior ethos that made Elliot the kind of leader who inspired absolute loyalty. He could be foolhardy with his own safety, exposing himself to enemy fire in ways that risked leaving his brigade without its commander, while carefully husbanding the lives of his soldiers and protesting vigorously when higher headquarters ordered operations that seemed likely to produce casualties without corresponding tactical gains. His frank reports criticizing senior British commanders and British units that failed to achieve their objectives on his flanks, leaving Australian units exposed to enemy fire because British attacks had broken down, made him unwelcome at higher headquarters, where such honesty was viewed as lack of tact and failure to understand that coalition warfare required diplomatic handling of Allied sensitivities. Within the 15th Brigade, he commanded the kind of respect that made men believe any operation Elliot said was possible must therefore be achievable through courage and skill, a belief that would be shattered at Fromelles, when even Elliot's leadership could not overcome the fundamental impossibility of the task his brigade was ordered to accomplish. The British officer who would order Elliot's brigade into the disaster at Fromelles had already demonstrated catastrophic judgment in previous operations that should have disqualified him from commanding any attack where soldiers' lives depended on his decisions. Lieutenant General Sir Richard Cyril Byrne Haking, born on the 24th of January, 1862, had commanded the 1st Division at the Battle of Aubers Ridge in May of 1915, where his 3 attacking brigades suffered 11,600 casualties in a single day of fighting, with nearly 4,000 of those casualties coming from his own division. The attack at Aubers Ridge achieved absolutely nothing, breaking down within an hour as German machine guns massacred British infantry, attempting to cross open ground against prepared defensive positions, almost identical to those at Fromelles. Haking responded to this failure by arguing for further attacks, despite overwhelming evidence that the operation could not succeed with available forces and available artillery support, demonstrating the kind of stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality that would characterize his entire approach to the Fromelles operation. His promotion to command the 11th Corps on the 1st of September, 1915, came through General Haig's patronage, recognition of Haking's reputation as a thruster willing to attack aggressively regardless of casualties, exactly the kind of commander that Haig valued, because he believed the war could only be won through offensive operations that accepted heavy casualties as the inevitable price of victory. Soldiers under Haking's command called him a butcher, a nickname he acquired during the war itself rather than in post-war histories written by critics with the benefit of hindsight. A rare distinction because most First World War generals who earned reputations for wasting lives received those reputations from historians decades after the war ended. Haking earned his reputation among troops who were still fighting under his command. Soldiers who believed their corps commander was willing to sacrifice their lives in attacks that had no reasonable chance of success. A damning judgment from men who accepted that casualties were inevitable in war, but refused to accept that their lives should be thrown away in operations that competent commanders would never have ordered. On the 14th of July, 1916, 8 days after receiving orders to plan a diversionary attack in the Fromelles sector, Haking issued attack orders for an operation that contained multiple fatal flaws obvious to anyone with Western Front experience. The plan called for 2 divisions to assault German positions along a 4,000-yard front between the Fauquissart-Trivellay Road and Cordonnerie Farm, attacking toward objectives that aerial reconnaissance had identified, but that existed more in the imagination of intelligence officers than in the reality of the battlefield. The 5th Australian Division would attack from the left, the northern flank of the assault, advancing southward against the left flank of the German salient, while the 61st British Division, the 2nd South Midland Division, a territorial force formation that, like the 5th Australian Division, had never experienced Western Front combat, attacked from the right, advancing eastward against the salient's western face. Each division would deploy 3 brigades in line with 2 battalions from each brigade leading the assault and 2 battalions in reserve, ready to exploit success by pushing through captured German positions toward deeper objectives or to reinforce positions captured during the initial rush if German counterattacks threatened to retake ground that had been won. The attack would begin at 6 o'clock on the evening of the 19th of July, a timing decision that gave attackers 3.5 hours of remaining daylight in the long summer evenings of northern France, ensuring that German machine gunners and artillery observers would enjoy perfect visibility as Australian and British infantry crossed open ground toward prepared defensive positions. This timing decision alone should have caused any competent commander to reconsider the entire operation. Standard British tactical doctrine throughout the First World War emphasized attacking at dawn when darkness provided cover for troops moving into assembly positions, and the first light of day coincided with the moment when infantry went over the top, using the transition from darkness to daylight to create confusion among defenders who were adjusting to changing visibility conditions. Attacking in full daylight in mid-evening gave German defenders every advantage, allowing them to see attacking forces from the moment they emerged from their trenches and to bring devastating fire to bear throughout the entire advance across no man's land. The preliminary bombardment began on the 16th of July, 3 full days before the infantry assault, telegraphing Allied intentions to German commanders who used the warning time to move reserves into position, ensure their artillery had ammunition stockpiled for the defensive battle they now knew was coming, and prepare their infantry for the attack that British artillery had announced as clearly as if printed notices had been distributed to German headquarters. The bombardment was intended to accomplish multiple objectives that proved impossible to achieve with available artillery. It was supposed to cut barbed wire protecting German trenches, creating gaps through which attacking infantry could pass without becoming entangled in wire obstacles where they would be massacred by German machine gunners shooting at stationary targets. It was supposed to destroy German machine gun positions, eliminating the weapons that represented the greatest threat to attacking infantry crossing open ground. It was supposed to inflict mass casualties on German infantry in forward trenches, reducing them to what planning documents described as a state of moral and physical collapse that would allow British and Australian soldiers to walk across no man's land and occupy trenches too devastated to offer resistance. Reality proved different from these optimistic assumptions. The Australian divisional artillery consisted of inexperienced gunners who had never fired in support of an attack on the Western Front. Using guns that had been issued to the division shortly before deployment to France, firing with inadequate ammunition stocks at ranges where precision was difficult, and observation of fall of shot nearly impossible because German artillery was targeting Australian observation posts and forward positions. Many shells fell short of their intended targets, landing on Australian frontline positions and causing casualties among the soldiers who would have to make the attack, undermining morale before the battle even began, as men realized that their own artillery was as dangerous as German fire. Wire cutting proved inadequate across most of the front, with aerial photographs taken after the bombardment showing that barbed wire obstacles remained intact in many locations, where gaps would be essential for attacking infantry to have any chance of reaching German trenches. German bunkers survived bombardment that would have destroyed ordinary field fortifications, but made no impression whatsoever on concrete shelters specifically designed to withstand heavy artillery fire. Shelters where German machine gun crews waited in safety until the bombardment lifted and then emerged to man their weapons as Australian and British infantry began their advance. Intelligence failures compounded the problems created by inadequate firepower and flawed timing. Aerial reconnaissance photographs taken in the weeks before the attack showed what British intelligence officers identified as a German third line of trenches, approximately 400 yards behind the front line positions. A defensive system that became the attack's stated objective and the basis for all operational planning. Australian and British infantry were ordered to break through the German front line using the initial rush supported by the artillery bombardment, advance across the captured front-line trench to attack and capture the German second line, then push forward another 400 yards to seize this supposed third line before consolidating captured ground against the inevitable German counterattacks that would attempt to retake lost positions. The supposed third line that appeared so clearly on aerial photographs, and that became the objective toward which thousands of soldiers would attack, was in fact nothing more than abandoned ditches and remnants of old field fortifications left over from earlier phases of the war. Muddy depressions that aerial photography suggested were functional trenches, but which offered no tactical value whatsoever, and which did not contain any German defenders because there was nothing there to defend. Soldiers who fought their way through two lines of German trenches at enormous cost, who crossed 400 yards of open ground under devastating fire, who overcame German resistance in brutal close-quarters fighting, would then search desperately for a third line that did not exist while German counterattacks developed against their exposed positions. The entire operational concept rested on capturing terrain that was not actually there, on defeating defenses that existed only in the imagination of intelligence officers who had misinterpreted aerial photographs. The Germans knew the attack was coming long before the preliminary bombardment announced British intentions. On the 15th of July, 4 days before the infantry assault, the British launched a gas attack opposite Neuve-Chapelle and Focissart, attempting to inflict casualties on German positions and create the impression that attacks might develop at multiple points along the line. German artillery responded by bombarding British frontline positions in retaliation, standard operating procedure that punished gas attacks by making the launching positions uninhabitable. That same night, 100 troops from Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 21 conducted a raid against Australian positions, a large-scale operation involving 4 full companies that penetrated Australian forward trenches, fought pitched battles with Australian defenders, caused nearly 100 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing, took 3 prisoners who were hustled back to German lines for interrogation, and returned to their own positions with captured documents that provided detailed information about Allied plans. The prisoners under interrogation and the captured documents confirmed through multiple independent sources that a major attack was imminent, allowing German commanders to alert their forces and prepare defensive measures with plenty of time to ensure everything was ready when the attack finally came. German observation posts scattered throughout the sector, some positioned in fortified positions on Aubers Ridge, others camouflaged within trees or disguised as haystacks or other agricultural features, watched Australian assembly areas where thousands of soldiers gathered in trenches and approach routes that would funnel them toward jumping-off positions when 0 hour arrived. French civilians in local estaminets, the small cafes and bars that dotted the rear areas behind the front lines, asked British and Australian soldiers who came in for drinks when the big day would be, demonstrating that operational security had failed so completely that even non-combatants knew an attack was planned and were curious about the exact date and time. Second Lieutenant Waldo Zander of the 30th Battalion later recalled in his diary and letters home his confusion over mixed messages from higher headquarters about the operation and his dismay that security had broken down to the point where French civilians were discussing the upcoming attack openly with soldiers who were supposed to be maintaining silence about military operations. As soldiers moved into assault positions during the day of the 19th of July, German artillery opened fire on assembly areas and communication trenches with accuracy that suggested German artillery officers knew exactly where Australian troops were gathering, causing hundreds of casualties before the attack even began, and creating traffic jams in communication trenches choked with wounded men trying to move back toward medical aid stations while fresh troops attempted to move forward toward their assault positions. Men walking down the Arrow Strait D-175 road from their billets in rear areas toward the front line past gun lines where British and Australian artillery were firing the preparatory bombardment, a display of firepower that impressed soldiers accustomed to the smaller-scale operations at Gallipoli, where artillery support was limited by the difficulty of landing heavy guns on the beaches and moving them into position. The thunder of hundreds of guns firing simultaneously, the sight of shells arcing overhead toward German positions, the ground shaking from the concussion of heavy artillery, all created an impression of overwhelming force that seemed to promise the German defenses would be obliterated before infantry had to advance. Some men stopped at estaminets still open despite the proximity to the front line, taking a final drink before battle in a ritual that acknowledged the odds many of them faced. Others simply walked forward, carrying the equipment and weapons they would need for the assault. Steel helmets for those fortunate enough to have been issued them, because helmet production could not keep pace with the expansion of British forces, rifles, and ammunition, weighing 9 pounds for the rifle, and another 10 to 15 pounds for ammunition and grenades, entrenching tools for digging in once objectives were captured. All the apparatus of infantry assault loaded onto men who understood from the intensity of German shelling that something had gone badly wrong with whatever plan higher headquarters had developed. At 6 o'clock on the evening of the 19th of July, 1916, at the exact moment when staff officers' watches showed that 0 hour had arrived, soldiers of the 5th Australian Division climbed from their trenches and began walking across open ground toward German positions that lay between 100 and 400 yards distant, depending on the width of no man's land at different points along the attack frontage. The experience of the 3 Australian brigades diverged immediately, creating what were effectively three separate battles that shared only the common element of catastrophic casualties and the futility of attacking prepared positions defended by veteran troops who enjoyed every advantage of ground, firepower, and observation. On the right flank, where Brigadier General Harold Elliott's 15th Brigade attacked toward the Sugarloaf salient, German machine guns positioned in concrete pillboxes with perfect fields of fire that had been carefully calculated during the months of quiet that preceded the battle, opened fire immediately as Australian infantry emerged from their trenches and began advancing. The 59th and 60th Battalions, advancing in the first wave of Elliott's assault, walked into a storm of machine gun fire so intense that men fell in rows like wheat being cut by a scythe. Soldiers cut down before they had covered even half the distance to German positions. Elliott had protested vigorously before the battle that no man's land in his brigade sector was too wide for the attack to have any chance of success, pointing out this tactical reality to Major HCL. Howard, a staff officer from Field Marshal Haig's General Headquarters, who was visiting forward positions to assess preparations for the attack. Howard, to his credit, agreed with Elliott's assessment after personally observing the ground, and returned to Haig's headquarters to report that the operation was doomed to fail because the tactical situation made success impossible with available forces and available artillery support. Haig annotated Howard's report with a note indicating that the attack should proceed only if sufficient guns and ammunition were available to suppress German defenses. But this caveat was ignored by Lieutenant General Haking, who was determined to proceed regardless of obstacles. The 58th Battalion attacked, despite receiving a postponement order that never reached all elements of the battalion because communication systems broke down under German artillery fire, with some companies going over the top at 0 hour, while others remained in their trenches waiting for orders, creating confusion that compounded the disaster as waves of attacking infantry became intermixed and command structures disintegrated. The 60th Battalion, consisting of 887 men when it went into the attack, would see only 107 survive the battle unwounded, a casualty rate of nearly 90% that made it one of the most devastating single battalion losses of the entire war. The mathematics of destruction were simple and brutal. Men advancing at walking pace across 400 yards of open ground needed approximately 5 minutes to reach German trenches if they encountered no obstacles and suffered no casualties. German machine gunners firing belt-fed weapons could sustain rates of fire approaching 500 rounds per minute, allowing each machine gun to fire 2,500 rounds during those 5 minutes. The 15th Brigade frontage was covered by dozens of German machine guns in positions that provided interlocking fields of fire, creating a killing zone where survival was impossible and where courage and training meant nothing because no amount of individual skill or unit cohesion could overcome the simple mathematics of machine gun fire against unprotected infantry crossing open ground. In the center of the Australian attack, where Brigadier General Harold Pope's 14th Brigade advanced against German positions that were less strongly held than the Sugarloaf, but still formidably defended, initial success created the illusion that the operation might achieve something, despite the disasters developing on both flanks. The brigade's assault battalions, all 4 of them recruited from New South Wales, and carrying the regional pride of soldiers who believed New South Wales units were the best in the Australian Imperial Force, broke through the German front line after suffering heavy casualties during the advance across no man's land, but maintaining enough cohesion to close with German positions and overcome the defenders in close quarters fighting. They pushed forward beyond the captured front line to assault and capture portions of the German second line as well. achieving the objectives specified in the attack orders and creating the impression that the operation was succeeding, at least in this sector. Even if reports from the flanks indicated that the 15th Brigade on the right and the 8th Brigade on the left were encountering serious difficulties. Carrying parties followed the assault waves with sandbags and ammunition, struggling through communication trenches that German artillery had targeted with devastating accuracy and that were being transformed into charnel houses as high explosive shells detonated among tightly packed soldiers who had no room to take cover and nowhere to go except forward toward the captured German positions or backward toward Australian lines. Engineers began digging a new communication trench, called a sap, across no man's land from the Australian front line to the captured German positions, a massive undertaking that would allow reinforcements and supplies to reach the captured positions without having to cross open ground under observation where German machine gunners and artillery could massacre anyone who attempted the journey. German artillery discovered this crucial work almost immediately and subjected the SAP to bombardment so accurate and sustained that survivors described the trench as a scene from hell, filled with men groaning and crying and shrieking as wounds and death found them in a confined space that offered no escape from the shells that detonated with mechanical regularity. The 14th Brigade soldiers, who reached the German second line and overcame the defenders in vicious fighting, began searching for the third line that intelligence reports and attack orders had identified as the final objective, finding instead only the muddy abandoned ditches that aerial photography had misidentified as functional trenches. They attempted to organize defensive positions in the captured German trenches, discovering that the trenches faced the wrong direction because they had been built to defend against attacks coming from the west. But now Australian soldiers occupying these positions needed to defend against German counterattacks that would come from the east. They tried to fill sandbags with the wet mud that was the only available material for creating protective parapets, discovering that the gluey soil would not hold together properly and that creating anything resembling a functional defensive position was impossible under the conditions of combat, with German artillery bombarding their positions continuously, and German infantry preparing counterattacks that would attempt to retake the lost ground before Australians could consolidate their hold on captured positions. On the left flank of the Australian attack, where Brigadier General Edwin Tivey's 8th Brigade advanced toward objectives that extended the attack frontage northward from the 14th Brigade's sector, soldiers achieved initial success in reaching German trenches and overcoming defenders, only to discover that their success created a tactical nightmare when the British 61st Division's assault on the Sugarloaf failed completely and left the entire Australian right flank exposed to German fire from positions that should have been captured by British forces, but remained fully functional and pouring enfilade fire into Australian soldiers who had advanced beyond their start lines. The British 61st Division, a territorial force formation recruited from Midlands counties and filled with men who, like their Australian counterparts, had never experienced Western Front combat, attacked across the same kind of open ground that faced the Australian 15th Brigade, advancing toward the Sugarloaf strong point, where German defenders enjoyed every advantage of position, firepower, and observation that 2 years of fortification work could provide. British battalions were cut down as thoroughly as the Australian 15th Brigade, achieving absolutely nothing except additional casualties that added to the day's total without contributing anything to whatever limited success the Australian 14th Brigade was achieving in the center of the attack. The complete failure of the British attack meant that the Australian 8th Brigade, holding captured German trenches on the Australian left flank, now faced fire from 3 directions simultaneously, isolated from support because movement across no man's land was suicidal under German observation and unable to advance further because the objectives that had been planned assumed British forces would be advancing on the right flank in coordination with Australian movements. At 8 o'clock in the evening, 2 hours after the initial assault began, and at a time when summer daylight was finally fading toward the darkness that might have provided some concealment and protection for the isolated Australian soldiers in captured German positions, German commanders launched the first organized counterattack using fresh troops that had been held in reserve for exactly this purpose. Fresh battalions from Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 21 and elements of Bavarian Reserve Regiment 20 moved forward from reserve positions 2 to 3 miles behind the front lines, advancing through communication trenches that allowed them to reach the threatened sector without exposing themselves to British and Australian artillery fire that was still bombarding German frontline positions. The German counterattack developed in increasing darkness as the summer evening finally gave way to night, creating confusion for both attackers and defenders as German infantry attempted to identify friend from enemy in captured trenches where Australian and German soldiers were intermixed and where the fog of battle made command and control nearly impossible. The assault fell apart before achieving its immediate objective of retaking all lost ground, with German infantry becoming disorganized under defensive fires from Australian soldiers who had established hasty defensive positions in the captured trenches and who were fighting with the desperation of men who understood that their survival depended on holding what they had captured, because retreating across no man's land in darkness under German fire would be as suicidal as the advance had been in daylight. German artillery maintained constant bombardment of Australian positions throughout the night, making resupply impossible because carrying parties attempting to cross no man's land with ammunition and supplies were massacred by German artillery fire directed by observers who could see the flash of explosions and adjust fire to bracket any movement detected in no man's land, ensuring that soldiers who had fought their way into German trenches would receive no reinforcement of ammunition that was being exhausted through constant defensive fighting, no medical supplies for the mounting casualties that were overwhelming the small number of medical personnel who had advanced with the assault waves, and no clear orders from higher headquarters about whether they should attempt to hold their positions or withdraw back to Australian lines under cover of darkness before German counterattacks overwhelmed them. As darkness fell completely across the battlefield, as the long summer twilight finally gave way to the moonless night that Australian soldiers had hoped would arrive soon enough to provide cover for consolidation, but which came too late to prevent German observers from watching every movement during the critical hours after the initial assault. The Australians who had reached German positions found themselves fighting for survival in a nightmare environment where distinguishing friend from enemy was nearly impossible in the darkness, where casualties accumulated faster than they could be evacuated, even to the minimal shelter of captured German dugouts, where ammunition stocks dwindled toward complete exhaustion as hours of continuous fighting consumed bullets and grenades at rates that pre-battle planning had never anticipated, and where the only certainty was that German counterattacks would continue through the remaining hours of darkness until either the Australians were overwhelmed or German commanders decided that the cost of retaking lost ground exceeded its value. Major General Mackay at division headquarters, located well behind the front lines, received fragmentary reports throughout the evening and night, suggesting both success and disaster simultaneously, conflicting information that made coherent understanding of the tactical situation impossible, and that prevented effective decision-making about whether to commit reserves to exploit success or to authorize withdrawal before losses became even more catastrophic than they already were. Some reports indicated that battalions had captured their objectives and were consolidating positions in preparation for the inevitable German counterattacks, suggesting that the operation was succeeding and that committing reserves might allow exploitation of the breakthrough. Other reports described complete breakdown, with battalions shattered in no man's land during the advance, wounded piling up faster than medical services could handle them, communication trenches transformed into butcher shops where German artillery was systematically destroying carrying parties attempting to resupply forward positions, and command structures disintegrating as officers became casualties and units lost cohesion. Mackay considered ordering further attacks to exploit what some reports suggested might be genuine success, unaware that the soldiers reporting success were isolated in untenable positions that could not be supplied or reinforced, and that any commitment of additional troops would simply add to the casualty lists without achieving anything of tactical value or improving the situation of the soldiers already trapped in captured German positions. Lieutenant General Haking, commanding 11th Corps from headquarters at Silly-sur-Lys, several miles behind the front lines, and even further removed from the reality of the battle than Mackay at division headquarters, received similarly contradictory information filtered through multiple layers of command and maintained the aggressive optimism that characterized his entire approach to military operations, and that had survived the disaster at Aubers Ridge the previous year, without teaching him anything about the limitations of frontal assaults against prepared positions. He believed the attack was achieving its strategic purpose of fixing German reserves in place and preventing them from reinforcing the Somme battlefield, and he judged that casualties, while regrettable, represented the inevitable price that must be paid for demonstrating Allied offensive spirit and maintaining pressure on German forces along the entire Western Front. Throughout the night of the 19th to the 20th of July, German counterattacks continued with mechanical precision, following pre-planned responses to penetrations of their defensive system. Fresh companies moved forward from reserve positions, attacked along routes that had been reconnoitered during the months of quiet before the battle, were repulsed by Australian defensive fire, supported by British artillery that was finally achieving some effectiveness now that targets were German troops in the open rather than concrete fortifications, withdrew to regroup and reorganize, and attacked again from different directions in attempts to find weak points in Australian defensive positions. The pattern repeated itself through the hours of darkness until 6 o'clock on the morning of the 20th of July, when a major German assault, using forces that had been assembling throughout the night, recaptured most of the ground that had been lost during the initial Australian breakthrough the previous evening. Remaining Australian soldiers in the former German trenches found themselves surrounded on three sides by German forces that had infiltrated through gaps in the Australian defensive line, their ammunition nearly exhausted after 10 hours of continuous fighting, their casualties including most of the officers and senior non-commissioned officers who might have organized continued resistance or coordinated an orderly withdrawal, and their communication with higher headquarters completely severed by German artillery fire that had destroyed telephone lines and killed or wounded most of the runners who had attempted to carry messages across no man's land to report on the situation in captured positions and request instructions about whether to hold or withdraw. When dawn broke on the morning of the 20th of July, an increasing daylight revealed the battlefield with the brutal clarity that had been mercifully hidden by darkness. The full extent of the disaster became impossible to conceal or minimize through optimistic interpretations of fragmentary reports. Bodies lay scattered across the 400 yards of open ground between the Australian and German front lines. Bodies of Australian soldiers who had died during the advance the previous evening, attempting to reach German positions. Bodies of soldiers killed during the night, while attempting to withdraw from untenable positions in captured German trenches. Bodies sprawled in every position and attitude that sudden death creates. No man's land was not empty space between opposing armies, but a vast cemetery littered with the dead who lay where they had fallen because retrieving bodies under German observation and fire was impossible. The dead sprawled in positions that told stories of how they had died for anyone with eyes to read those stories. Some soldiers clearly killed while running forward with rifles at port arms, cut down by machine gun fire that caught them in mid-stride. Others killed while attempting to crawl back to safety after being wounded. Their bodies oriented toward Australian lines with hands stretched forward, as if still reaching for safety that they never achieved. Some dead had sought cover in shell craters or agricultural drainage ditches, where they had found only temporary refuge before German machine guns or artillery discovered them. Their bodies huddled in the depressions that had failed to provide the protection they sought. The remaining Australians in German positions, those who had survived 10 hours of continuous fighting and German counterattacks and artillery bombardment, recognized at first light, when they could see their tactical situation clearly, that continuing to hold their positions was hopeless, that the positions they occupied could not be supplied or reinforced because German artillery and machine guns commanded all the approaches across no man's land, and that staying in place meant certain capture or death when the next German counterattack came with sufficient force to overwhelm defenders whose ammunition was nearly exhausted and whose numbers had been reduced by casualties to the point where defensive lines could no longer be maintained. Major General Mackay received reports throughout the early morning hours from officers who had made it back to Australian lines after abandoning captured German positions. Reports that made the situation clear enough that further attacks were obviously impossible, and that the only remaining question was whether remaining Australian soldiers in German positions could be extracted before they were killed or captured. He passed this information to Lieutenant General Haking at Corps Headquarters, and by mid-morning on the 20th of July, the decision had been made that withdrawal was the only option remaining. Though implementing that decision would cost hundreds more casualties as men attempted to cross the same open ground they had traversed the previous evening, now attempting to move in full daylight with German machine gunners tracking their movement across every meter of no man's land. Many wounded Australian soldiers had to be left behind in captured German positions and in no man's land, men too seriously injured to move under their own power and impossible to carry while under fire from German positions that commanded all approaches to and from the captured trenches. Some groups of Australian soldiers found themselves completely surrounded, cut off from any route back to Australian lines by German forces that had infiltrated between Australian positions during the night and that now blocked any possibility of withdrawal. These men, numbering 470, according to German records compiled after the battle, surrendered when it became clear that continued resistance would achieve nothing except ensuring their deaths without inflicting corresponding losses on German forces that could simply maintain their encirclement and wait for Australian ammunition to be completely exhausted. By 9:20 on the morning of the 20th of July, a German officer at regimental headquarters noted in his report that the remaining enemy forces had withdrawn or been captured, that the attack had been completely repulsed, that German positions were being reoccupied and strengthened in preparation for possible renewed assaults that higher command believed might follow, since British and Australian forces had demonstrated their willingness to attack, despite suffering catastrophic casualties. Brigadier General Harold Elliott met the survivors of his 15th Brigade as they came out of the line during the morning of the 20th of July. Walking among his men who were returning from the worst experience of their military careers, offering words of comfort to the wounded who could still walk, greeting soldiers by name as they passed him, acknowledging their courage and the terrible losses they had suffered without achieving any of the objectives they had been ordered to capture. After spending time with his returning soldiers, ensuring they knew their brigade commander recognized what they had endured and honored their sacrifice. Even though the operation had failed completely, Elliott went straight back inside his headquarters building, closed the door behind him, sat down at his desk, put his head in his hands, and sobbed uncontrollably, weeping for the soldiers who had died following his orders into an attack he had known was hopeless, grieving for the destruction of a brigade he had trained and led and protected as carefully as any commander could protect soldiers in modern war. His brigade had suffered 1,804 casualties out of the 5,533 total Australian losses, nearly one-third of the entire division's casualties, concentrated in the 4 battalions of the 15th Brigade that had attacked the most heavily defended section of the German line. Elliott's grief focused particularly on 2 officers whose deaths affected him personally, beyond the general sorrow any commander feels for soldiers lost under his command. Major Tom Elliott, 22 years old and no relation to the brigade commander despite sharing a surname, was a young officer who had shown great potential as a leader and whom Harold Elliott had tried unsuccessfully to keep out of the fighting by assigning him to staff duties. Orders that Tom Elliott had quietly ignored because he believed his place was with his men in the assault. Major Jeffrey McCrae, who commanded the 60th Battalion that suffered the highest casualty rate of any battalion in the 5th Division, had served with Harold Elliott at Gallipoli and in the militia forces before the war, a personal friend as well as a subordinate officer. McCrae had gone into the battle as part of the 4th Wave over the parapet, advancing across no man's land toward German positions, and never returned to Australian lines, killed somewhere in the 400 yards between the jumping-off trenches and the German positions that had destroyed his battalion. Other battalion commanders throughout the 5th Division were similarly observed weeping as they counted the cost of an operation that had achieved nothing, that had not captured ground, had not inflicted disproportionate casualties on German defenders, had not prevented German reinforcements from moving to the Somme, had accomplished none of the objectives that might have justified the losses. The recovery of wounded continued through the 20th, 21st, and 22nd of July, a grim process complicated by German artillery fire that continued to make no man's land dangerous to cross, and by the decision made at division headquarters to refuse a German ceasefire offer that would have allowed both sides to recover wounded without the constant threat of being killed while performing this humanitarian work. Australian soldiers risked their lives repeatedly to bring back wounded comrades, sometimes crawling into no man's land at night under cover of darkness to reach men who lay calling for help, sometimes using the cover of darkness to establish contact with wounded soldiers who could not move, but who could be given water and have their wounds bandaged, where they lay until a subsequent night when they might be strong enough to be carried back to Australian lines, or could crawl back themselves. The Germans gathered many wounded from areas their patrols could reach safely, treating these soldiers as prisoners of war according to the laws of war, but also providing medical care that saved lives that would have been lost if these wounded had remained in no man's land without treatment. Elsewhere, throughout the battlefield, wounded men lay in shell craters or agricultural ditches for days. some dying of wounds that might have been treatable had they reached medical care quickly, others surviving through sheer determination and extraordinary luck. On the 22nd of July, 4 days after the battle, German engineers began the task of burying Allied dead that lay in areas under German control, using narrow-gauge trench railway to transport bodies from the battlefield to burial sites behind German lines where mass graves could be constructed. They dug 8 large pits near a small wood that British military maps identified as Pheasant Wood, each pit measuring 10 meters long, 2.2 meters wide, and 5 meters deep, dimensions calculated to hold approximately 50 bodies per pit, depending on how tightly bodies were packed. Approximately 250 to 400 bodies were buried in these 8 graves. Australian and British soldiers who had died close enough to German positions that German recovery teams could gather them without exposing themselves to fire from Australian positions. The graves were photographed from British reconnaissance aircraft on the 21st of July during routine aerial reconnaissance missions over German rear areas. But the photographs taken from several thousand feet altitude were annotated incorrectly by photo interpreters at British intelligence headquarters, who marked the rectangular excavations as showing German dugouts or trench mortar positions rather than recognizing them as burial pits. An error that would have consequences lasting 90 years and would leave families without knowledge of where their loved ones were buried. German military records documented these burials with the characteristic efficiency that marked German military administration throughout the war, noting the location near Pheasant Wood and the approximate numbers of bodies buried in each pit, filing reports that would sit undisturbed in Bavarian military archives in Munich for 9 decades before anyone thought to search German records for information about Australian missing. The 5th Australian Division suffered 5,533 casualties during less than 24 hours of combat operations at Fromelles. 1,957 soldiers were killed or died of wounds, a death toll that, when calculated, exceeded the total Australian fatalities in 3 separate wars: the Boer War, where Australia's casualties were relatively light, the Korean War, where Australian participation was limited, and the Vietnam War, where Australian forces served in relatively small numbers compared to American forces. Approximately 3,300 soldiers were wounded severely enough to require medical evacuation. Men who survived the battle, but who would carry physical and psychological scars from Fromelles for the remainder of their lives. 470 soldiers became prisoners of war, men captured when their positions were surrounded and escape became impossible, or who were too badly wounded to withdraw when the decision was made to abandon captured German positions. The British 61st Division, attacking with approximately half as many men as the 5th Australian Division deployed, suffered 1,547 casualties, including 519 soldiers killed or died of wounds. Combined Allied casualties from both divisions totaled 7,080, losses sustained during an operation that captured no ground permanently, achieved no tactical advantage that justified the cost, and failed completely in its stated strategic purpose of preventing German reinforcements from moving to the Somme battlefield, where the main British offensive continued. The German 6th Bavarian Reserve Division that defended the Fromelles sector suffered between 1,600 and 2,000 casualties, according to German records, losses that represented a small fraction of Allied casualties, despite German forces being on the receiving end of 3 days of preliminary artillery bombardment and having to repulse multiple infantry assaults that lasted from 6 o'clock on the evening of the 19th of July until dawn on the 20th of July. German forces captured 150 prisoners during the battle, and recovered extensive documentation from captured positions and dead Allied soldiers, material that provided German intelligence officers with detailed information about Allied planning and preparations. The casualty ratio of approximately 4 Allied casualties for every German casualty reflected the fundamental tactical reality that First World War military technology and tactics made attacking across open ground against prepared defensive positions, defended by machine guns and artillery, a recipe for catastrophic losses. A lesson that the Battle of the Somme had demonstrated on the 1st of July, and that Fromelles confirmed 2.5 weeks later. The front line on the morning of the 20th of July sat exactly where it had been on the evening of the 19th of July before the attack began, with no tactical advantage gained to show for the 7,000 Allied casualties that the operation had cost.